You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. It's always good to come your way, even during times of crises with the pandemic still going at it. We're all learning a new normal, and that's certainly true for me, as I know it is for you. Fortunately, if you have a loving home, you're learning how to love. If not so loving home, you're learning how to love. Bible study is a great time during isolation, and so we'll get right into Mark right after this short break. You hang in there with us.
WOW works with local churches in needy countries. We mobilize those churches, pastors, and volunteers in a concerted effort to care for orphans and widows in their homes and villages. Through that strong faith-based platform, we're able to not only provide food, medicine, and crisis intervention, but we're also able to lead these afflicted ones to faith in God. It's powerful, humbling, and well worth the effort. Please support WOW with your generous gifts and faithful prayer. Thank you.
Hard to believe, friends, but we're actually now into the middle of the book of Mark. We're going at it slow, but slow and easy wins the race, or slow and steady wins the race. But I'm happy to announce that this is finally available, the second tranche of the book of Mark. This is for chapters 10 through 16. We're in 8, so we're still, for those of you who have the first one, we're still in the first one. But the second one's coming out, is available right now if you want to ask for it. Just make sure you get those coordinates during the breaks when we are promoting WOW Ministry and also JCT. And you can phone, you can email, you can log on. There's any number of ways of making sure you can get your copy. Just make sure you ask for it. And when you do, remember your best gift for this ministry. You know, this time of staying at home, this isolation culture that we're all learning, I think reluctantly, but we're learning it, shelter in place, is a very interesting time in terms of revisiting values. You know, you look at the various news feeds on the internet and you see from time to time prayer meetings emerging, hymns are being sung, you're even seeing prayers being prayed on some of the secular news networks. I'm not surprised by this, because under duress, when you begin to see a lot of the things you depended on and built your life on, basically of no relevance anymore, you get right down to the bare essentials. Who am I? What is my place in the world? Is there a God? If there is, what's my relationship with Him? How should I be in right relationship with Him? Those kinds of questions emerge. And then when you add stress to it, your only real reflex when you're stressed, without the normal sort of sustaining infrastructure that comes from our materialism, you reach out. Oh, God, help me. And we're seeing this more and more. Interestingly, churches who in the main are online are experiencing growth. More and more people watching every week. Some are beginning to support that never supported before. It's a phenomenal time. And so, as I've often said, there is a silver lining in this dark cloud of COVID-19. And as long as it lasts, you can be sure that, as Jesus himself said, he will continue building his church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Okay, we're in Mark chapter 8. Let's read it right from verse 1. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Now, we have before studied Jesus' miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, and I made the point then that the 5,000 were just the men. There were also women and children, and it could very well be closer to 10,000 people that were fed on that occasion. This is a different event. The former event was in the Upper Galilee, and the crowd were mainly Jewish. In this case, you have Jesus in what's known as the Decapolis. Now, Decapolis was a general term for 10 cities. We talk about a decade as being 10 years. From the Greek language, you've got Decapolis, referring to 10 cities. It was a federation, really, of these 10 Greek cities. Matthew talks about the Decapolis in Matthew chapter 4. Built by veterans, basically, of Alexander the Great's army, and most of them were east of the Jordan River. They were very welcoming to the rule of Rome because they were Gentiles. And the federation of these 10 cities was essentially for Roman self-defense. One of the cities of the Decapolis still exists. We now know it, if you've been there, as Bet Shan. I used to drive through Bet Shan twice a week back when I was pastoring in Jerusalem, because I was broadcasting as well up in southern Lebanon, and I would go down in the Jordan Valley from Jerusalem to Jericho and then up to Jordan Valley. And just before you get to the Sea of Galilee, you come to Bet Shan. In Jesus' time, it was known as Scythopolis. So you had Scythopolis on the west, you had Damascus on the north, a city called Philadelphia on the south. This is a big region, the Decapolis. It was on or close to the major trade routes, also the military highways that the Romans had built. It was Gentile in culture. It tolerated a few Jews, of course. But these people who had been following Jesus for 3 days were Gentiles. And Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles was not as extensive at that point as it had been to his own people, the Jews. But the word was getting out. And illness knows no racial boundaries, knows no national boundaries. And don't we know that right now with COVID-19? Anyhow, people are sick. They hear that the great healer is, 20, 30 miles away. Let's get to him now. And they followed him with great fervor, okay? So Jesus has compassion on them. 3 days they've been traveling with him. And you can imagine the kind of schedule Jesus must have kept right from morning till night, ministering to people, teaching, healing them. It must have been exhausting. And even as he sees the need of the people, he's probably thinking of his own need. But what do they have? They got 7 loaves and a few small fish. He orders them to sit down. He orders the disciples to feed them. And the disciples, of course, are incredulous. It's amazing how quickly we forget, huh? I remember reading one time something that Henry Kissinger said. He used to be Secretary of State years ago under Nixon. He said the world has a 45-day attention span. That's pretty much true. I think sometimes it's much less than that. It's amazing how quickly we can forget things. The disciples forgot what had happened with the feeding of the 5,000. And here's another situation, and they have the same kind of unbelief as they had then. So, what happens? Jesus feeds them. And once they're fed, he gets, as we saw here, he gets immediately into a boat, right? Let me just get my trusty pen out here and I'll do a little bit of writing. Immediately gets into a boat. Now I'm underlining that because you would think that he would hang around and maybe enjoy the plaudits and the grateful adulation of the crowd. No. He just gets on with it. Immediately went away, got into the boat, and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Now, I'm circling Dalmanutha for a reason. Dalmanutha was probably the city of Magdala. It was another name for Magdala. Magdala was a commercial fishing center just north of Tiberias and a few miles southwest of Capernaum. Capernaum was also a fishing center, but it was Magdala where most of the fish processing was done. So even back in those days, they still had to, gut the fish and cut off their heads or whatever and produce them and package them. I mean, this was a commercial enterprise. But you might sense with Magdala some relationship there with Mary Magdalene. Well, of course, Mary Magdalene was from Magdala. And it was only in the last 10 years, really, I think it was 2006, that the Israeli Antiquities Ministry began an archaeological dig there, right on the shore of the lake. When I used to drive by it, when I was pastoring in Jerusalem, it was just a ruins. There was a sign saying Magdala, but there was nothing there. You look down towards the lake from the road, about half a mile down to the water, and there was just, rubble, basically. Well, the archaeologists got to work and uncovered an amazing synagogue, for one thing, one of the most beautiful synagogue ruins I have seen anywhere in the world, with some beautiful artifacts from Jesus' time. It's a whole study in itself. But Magdala was also referred to as at least the region of Dalmanutha. And so Jesus goes there. As soon as he does this, the crowd catches up to him. The Sea of Galilee is small. It's about maybe 8 to 10 miles long and maybe 6 miles wide. I've been up on the Golan Heights on the east side many, many times looking down on the lake, and no kidding, it's just basically, by North American standards, just a little body of water. It's anything but a sea. It was also called Kinneret, which means harp in Hebrew. Why? Because it's shaped like a harp. It was also called at one point the Sea of Tiberias. It was also called, what else was it called? It'll come to me. But the point is that there's not much to it. It's just a little bitty lake. And yet, in Jesus' time, was full of fish. And interestingly, in your time, right now, if you were to go to Israel, you'd see that there's commercial fishing going on there every day. Mainly sardines, but also a bigger fish called St. Peter's fish, which is very tasty eating. But anyway, Magdala was right there on the shore, on the west side of the lake, just north of Tiberias. We'll take a little break and we'll pick it up from there in just a moment.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
So, Jesus has come across the lake to the region of Dalmanutha, probably to the city of Magdala, fish processing city. And the people caught up with him. Around this lake, I was telling you how small it is. People could run from one side to the other. I mean, it would take them several hours, but they see Jesus on the boat. They don't have a boat, but they start, walking around the lake, and they would catch up with him. It would take, depending on the weather, a few hours to get across the lake on a boat, and it might take them 2 or 3 times as much time to walk around or run around. Some of them ran, but Jesus was never free of crowds. And in those crowds were always those who opposed him, often referred to as the Pharisees, who were the part of the religious order. You had the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. The scribes were the legal experts in the law of Moses. The Pharisees, in the Hebrew prushim, they were the interpreters of the law and came from a strong rabbinical history. Their specialty was oral law. And then there were the Sadducees, who were the temple elite. They were the ones who ran all of the sacrificial processes at the temple in Jerusalem, and they also controlled the temple economy, which was huge. I mean, you had hundreds of thousands of people coming up to the temple over the course of any given year, and there was always money being exchanged for purchasing sacrifices or for various services that were provided. And this is why Jesus at one point went to the temple and drove out all of the money changers and all the merchants, because it was basically a marketplace. He said, "My house will be called a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves." But that's another story. Anyhow, let's read it in verse 11 of Mark 8. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, nothing new there, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I tell you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And I don't know why it says baskets generation up there. That must be a typo. He left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now, I got to take some time with this. The Pharisees had a malicious motive. Jesus totally offended them. And they saw him as a threat. They also saw him as an enemy. But they didn't know how to handle him, because what do you do with, thousands of people who are being healed of desperate health crises? Sometimes raising the dead. I mean, how do you argue with that? And so they had to come up with some way of rationalizing their opposition and trying to demonize him, okay? So in this case, what they do is they seek from him, right here, they seek from him a sign from heaven. What's going on there? They wanted him to do some kind of a wondrous sign that would appear to, be supernaturally charged. In other words, something from heaven. Something hopefully, with lightning or with rain or in the stars or something that would amaze the people. To do this, he would then be reduced to a kind of a sideshow. And as someone who had reduced his power to that of a sideshow, they would be reducing him to a mere magician, trying to make Jesus into a magician. You see, they had, their own wonder workers. There's always been those in history who've been able to astonish people with either their leisure domain, their ability to deceive, or in fact, some kind of remarkable power to do this or do that. I mean, libraries are full of people claiming to have certain powers and people witnessing to certain powers and so on. But they hoped that by getting Jesus to do that, they could reduce him to the level of other wonder workers. Jesus refused, and rightly so. He wasn't there to give signs. I'm not a magician, he's saying. I'm not somebody who's just here to aggrandize himself by astonishing you with his power. The only sign I'm going to give you is the ultimate sign, and that is resurrection. That's coming. Okay? Now, Jesus knew his time was not yet. You see this again and again in the Gospels. He refused to accept this or refused to do that because his time was not yet. Jesus knew there was a little bit of time yet before he would go to Jerusalem to be crucified and he would rise from the dead. But to reduce him to a magician, see, if he could agree to this, then he might fail at it. And then the Pharisees could say, well, see, he's just another would-be miracle worker, but he can't do these things. He's just no more than one of our Jewish mystics. Jesus said, no way. He sighs deeply in his spirit. What that tells you is he wasn't just disappointed. He was totally sad. Is there no one who gets it? No one who understands me? And this was a deep thing for him because time and again his own disciples let him down in this regard. They didn't really understand him either. Why is this generation seeking a sign? He's saying. Okay, so let's go to the next page. He left them and got into the boat again and departed to the other side. You know, these boats were a great relief for Jesus. If you've been to Israel in the last 20 years, you may have gone up to Tiberias, and if you've done that, you've gone to a museum that's built on the northern edge of Tiberias, just next to Magdala. It's a whole kibbutz museum that has one singular feature, and what it is what they call, get this, the Jesus boat. Years ago, when I lived there was quite a drought in Israel that prevailed for, I think it was 4 or 5 years. And at that time, the only source of fresh water for most of Israel was the Sea of Galilee. Now, they were getting some water from the coastal areas, the water table below Caesarea and Tel Aviv and so on, but they had been taking so much of that water that it was now becoming brackish. The Mediterranean water was managing to find its way to the groundwater. And so the only real fresh water was from the Sea of Galilee, and there was so much being drawn from it, not just for people's drinking and bathing purposes, but also for irrigating both the Israeli and the Jordanian farms that border the Jordan River in the Jordan Valley, that the water level had gone down, as I recall, about 18 feet. I remember being astonished as I would drive by it, you know. I remember when the water used to lap right up against the shore, and now there was just this barren, you know, rocky, more than gravel, kind of rough, black, stony bottom, and the water just kept receding and receding. Well, during that period of time, somebody, I don't know who it was walking along, maybe looking for, you know, special stones or something, and saw a couple of, looked like wooden stakes sticking out of the mud, and they were apprised of the age of the wood. Most Israelis have a real sense for, and they've been educated for, flora and fauna and also for archaeology. It's amazing. When my kids went to school in Jerusalem, they were learning archaeology and flora and fauna, like almost from grade 1. Anyway, this person went to some antiquities authority and said, you got to come and look at this. Sure enough, it looked like it could have been some of the support skeleton for a boat. So they came up, put a kind of a barrier around it, and began gently to work away at this thing, digging down slowly, almost with spoonfuls of mud, and sure enough discovered the essential skeleton of one of the fishing boats that they say, now this is the Israeli archaeologists, dates right back to the time of Jesus. Now, to get it out of the mud without it totally disintegrating took amazing skill, a lot of patience, and a lot of time. But eventually they were able to get it out and kind of put it back together again in its skeletal condition and mount it on a special mount in a special room they built on the kibbutz right on the edge of the lake. And it's been there now for about 20 years, called the Jesus boat. It's really worth seeing, friends. And it's amazing how small those boats are. Maybe, I'm trying to remember, maybe 20 feet long? and maybe 6 feet wide. Just a little boat, a little punt, really. And they would have had a mast and a little bit of a sail, tiller. But this is the kind of boat that Jesus was getting in, going back and forth across the lake. And it's little wonder that when the lake got rough, which it often did and often does, it's 400 feet below sea level. It's got the Golan Heights on one side. It's got the Horns of Hittim and other mountains on the west side. The wind comes across, sweeps down over the lake, and the lake can become a storm just like that. But these were the boats that Jesus used time and time again. These are the boats that he would sometimes get in because the crowd was pushing him to the shore, and he would move off from the shore a little bit in the water, and he would preach from the boat. This is what we're talking about here. So he gets in the boat. He's just come across the lake. He's going to go across the lake again. I'm telling you all this detail because it's interesting, and it gives you a sense of context. Jesus was just a human being. He had to take boats. He needed to eat bread. He needed to have sleep. And there were times that he was just weary in well-doing. So much to discover yet. I'll be back right after this.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
Friends, every JCT show, you see a couple of promos for WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. This is a missions ministry that my wife Kathy and I founded 20 years ago. We're now into our 21st year, working in sub-Saharan Africa with orphans and widows impacted by HIV and AIDS and other kinds of diseases and afflictions and suffering from dire poverty. We've just begun to work also in southern India in a modest way, and we work in partnership in parts of our ministry with Bible Discovery TV, with the Hembries. But during this COVID-19 crisis, our orphans and widows, they're already compromised in terms of their immune systems because of HIV and AIDS. They're in desperate straits, and we are doing extra to help them. If you can help us help them, that'd be great. The coordinates are always there. You can log on to them, or you can call, whatever. Support WOW. When you're supporting WOW, you're supporting JCT. We're a mutual admiration society, and we appreciate every cent. Thank you.